Frank Marshall threw away 2 pawns in the first 5 moves, on purpose, then spent 40 moves trying to checkmate a king that simply refused to die. This 19-0 for brawl swings from massacre to miracle and back again. Buckle up, this one does not end the way you think. We start simple. Marshall pushes the king pawn to e4, grabbing the center and opening lines for his bishop and queen. Classic stuff, but with Marshall behind the white pieces, classic never lasts long. The fuse is already lit. Mlotkowski mirrors him, planting a pawn on e5 and staking his own claim to the middle. Both sides grab at the central squares, the battleground for everything to come. Symmetry now, chaos very soon. Here it comes. White slams a second pawn to d4, challenging e5 head-on and daring black to start a fight in the center. This is the center game, and Marshall refuses a quiet life. A calmer player might develop a knight first. Marshall wants the board on fire. Black bites. The e5 pawn swings over and captures on d4, and just like that Mlotkowski is a pawn up. But that pawn is a poisoned gift. White's pieces are about to come pouring through the open center. Greed, meet danger. Out comes the cavalry. Marshall develops his knight to f3, eyeing the loose pawn on d4 and rushing a piece toward the action. Notice he doesn't hurry to win the pawn back, development first, points later. That's gambit thinking, a lead in pieces beats a lead in pawns. Check! Black's bishop leaps to b4 and rakes the board, hitting the white king from afar. Marshall has to respond right now, and that stolen tempo is exactly the cheeky disruption that makes this opening so sharp. The black pieces are getting involved fast. Marshall blocks calmly, sliding a pawn to c3 to break the check and offer yet another pawn into the bargain. This is full Danish gambit spirit now. Toss the pawns, blast open the lines, and aim everything at the black king. He is not here to count material. Greedily, black snaps it up, the d4 pawn captures on c3, and now Mlotkowski is 2 pawns to the good. On paper he's winning. On the board he's walking a tightrope over open files, with White's whole army loading up behind him. White recaptures, the b-pawn taking back on c3 and building a broad, menacing pawn chain in the center. Look at Marshall's position, bishops ready to fly out, lines wide open, every piece pointing at black's side. 2 pawns down and loving it. Coiling for the fight, black slides the bishop back to c5, eyeing the long diagonal and the tender f2 square near white's king. Mlotkowski develops with intent. Both sides are loaded now, and Marshall is the kind of player who shoots first. Bang, out flies white's bishop to c4, and now it stares straight at f7, the weakest square in black's camp. This is the dream gambit setup, bishop and queen teaming up on one fragile point right next to the king. Marshall is building a battering ram. Sensibly, Mlotkowski plays a pawn to d6, giving his bishop a retreat and freeing his cramped position to breathe. It's a modest, solid move in a wild game. Black just wants to finish developing and cling to those 2 extra pawns. Defense mode engaged. There it is. Marshall's queen swings out to b3 and joins the bishop in hammering f7, 2 attackers on 1 trembling pawn. Suddenly black has to find a defense or lose material right next to his king. This is the gambit paying off in pure pressure. Awkwardly, black's queen shuffles to d7 to guard f7 and untangle. It does the defensive job, but it's a passive square. The queen becomes a blocker rather than a fighter. Mlotkowski is surviving, not thriving, while white keeps every piece pointed at the king. Calmly, Marshall tucks his king into safety, castling kingside and bringing a rook toward the center in a single move. Even mid-assault, he secures his own monarch first, a small dose of discipline before the storm. Now everything is ready to fire. Developing at last, black brings a knight to c6, hitting toward the center and adding a defender to the camp. Mlotkowski is slowly catching up in piece activity, trying to prove those 2 extra pawns will matter once the smoke clears. Patience versus pressure. Repositioning, white's queen slides back to c2, off b3 but still humming with ideas, now eyeing the long diagonal and the king side. Marshall keeps the tension alive, refusing to trade or simplify. He wants pieces on the board, where attacks live. Black develops the knight to f6. Up swings white's bishop to g5, leaning hard on black's f6 knight and probing the soft squares around the king. Marshal keeps stacking pressure, daring Mlotkowski to crack. The black position is solid, but solid under a martial assault is a nervous place to be. Sidestepping, black's queen shifts to e7, bracing the king side and keeping everything held together by a thread. Mlotkowski reshuffles his defense one careful move at a time. Every white piece is aimed at the king, and black is answering with precise, patient defense. Reinforcing, Marshal's last knight comes out to d2, heading for the king side to throw even more wood on the fire. He's getting every single piece into the attack before committing to a breakthrough. 2 pawns down, full army mobilized, gambit chess at its purest. Cautiously, black pokes the bishop with a pawn to h6, asking g5 a hard question: trade or retreat? It's a natural move to ease the pressure, but pawn moves in front of a king always leave little scars behind. Mlotkowski is poking the bear. Holding firm, white's bishop slides back to h4, keeping the tension and refusing to be shooed away. Marshal maintains his grip on the f6 knight and keeps the attacking lines open. He's not trading anything that keeps black uncomfortable. Whoa, black lunges, throwing a pawn to g5 to chase the bishop and grab kingside space. It's bold, and it does kick the bishop, but those pawns in front of the king are lurching forward, leaving holes. Mlotkowski is gambling that activity beats safety here. Retreating with poison, white's bishop drops to g3, out of the pawn's reach but still glaring at black's weakened kingside. Marshal keeps the bishop alive and aimed at the soft spots those advancing pawns left behind. Every retreat here is really a reload. Aggressively, black's knight gallops to h5, attacking the g3 bishop and trying to trade off one of white's most dangerous attackers. It's committal, the knight is way out on the rim, far from the center. Mlotkowski wants to swap pieces and survive into a winning endgame. Now the center erupts. Marshal shoves a pawn to e5, ripping open lines and threatening to crash into d6 and tear black's structure apart. This is the moment the gambit was built for: pawns blown open, pieces ready to pour through. The dam is breaking. Snap, black's knight chops the g3 bishop off the board. Mlotkowski wins one of Marshal's prized attackers, but recapturing is about to tear open the h-file aimed straight at his own king. Be careful what you trade for. Crashing through, white's e-pawn captures on d6, smashing into black's camp and threatening ideas everywhere. Marshal ignores the hanging knight on g3 for a moment. The open lines and the pressure on black's king matter far more than a single piece. The attack is screaming. Here's the first real slip. Mlotkowski grabs the d6 pawn with his queen, natural, but wrong. The cool shot was bishop to f5, blunting white's queen and snuffing the attack cold. Instead the black queen drifts offside, and Marshal's pieces are still swarming the king. The swing comes back, and Marshal returns the favor. Tempted by the free knight, he recaptures with the h-pawn, but the killer was rook to e1 with check, slamming the open file at black's stuck king before grabbing anything. Pawns can wait, checkmate doesn't. Marshal takes the piece and lets the king wriggle free. Diving for cover, black castles kingside at last, whisking the king into the corner and connecting the rooks. After all that tension, Mlotkowski finally gets his monarch off the open center. It's a relief move, but he's castling into a kingside that's already been pried open. Shelter, with cracks. Loading up, Marshal swings a rook to d1, seizing the open central file and pointing it at black's queen and the heart of the board. He's bringing his last lazy piece into the attack. Every white unit now has a job, and every job is hunt the king. Tucking it away, black's bishop retreats to b6, dodging the rook's gaze and keeping the piece alive on a safe diagonal. Mlotkowski quietly improves while clinging to his extra pawns. He's playing for the long game, survive the storm, cash the material later. Too eager, Marshal sends the knight to g5, snatching a pawn and lunging at f7, but it overreaches. The clean path was bishop to b5, pinning black's defenders and tightening the screw. This knight just gets shoved back, and the attack sputters. Aggression without backup. Black's pawn captures the knight on g5. Regrouping, white's remaining knight hops back to f3, eyeing the kingside and trying to keep some pressure alive. Marshal has fewer pieces now, but he's not done, he's reorganizing for one more push. When you're a marshal, you always believe in one more attack. Big mistake, and a costly one. Black's queen sails to f6, bumping into white's ideas and inviting Marshal right back into the fight. The steady move was queen to h6, guarding calmly, keeping the extra material. Instead the queen wanders into trouble and the swing rushes toward white. Mlotkowski just let the fish off the hook. Pouncing, Marshal's rook charges to d5, dominating the center and threatening to swing across to the kingside where Black's king sits exposed. The pieces are flooding back toward the monarch. Suddenly the player who was losing is the one asking all the questions. Contesting, Black brings a rook to d8 to fight for the open file and challenge White's bold rook. Mlotkowski tries to trade off attackers and douse the fire. It's the right instinct when you're under siege, swap pieces and head for the calmer waters of an endgame. Slashing forward with check. Marshal's rook grabs the g5 pawn and checks the king, refusing to retreat and instead diving toward Black's monarch. Pure swashbuckler chess, keep the initiative burning and never let the defender breathe. Now the Black king has to walk. Scrambling, Black's king steps to f8, fleeing the check and tiptoeing away from the danger zone. Mlotkowski's monarch is out in the open, dancing on a knife's edge while White's heavy pieces circle. One slip from either side now decides everything. Striking deep, Marshal's queen knifes into h7, burrowing behind enemy lines and threatening mating ideas around the cornered king. The queen and rook are hunting together now. Black's position looks one move from collapse, but looks can lie in a game this sharp. Defending desperately, Black's knight drops back to e7, throwing a body in the way and shoring up the trembling kingside. Mlotkowski is in full survival mode, plugging holes as fast as Marshal pokes them. It's ugly, it's tense, and somehow it's holding. Boom! The bishop crashes onto f7. Marshal finally cracks the magic square, snatching the pawn his pieces have stared at all game and tearing at the king's last shelter. The f7 point was the target from move 6, and now it falls. The attack reaches a fever pitch. Counter-punching, Black's bishop springs to f5, hitting White's queen and trying to wreck the attacking coordination. Mlotkowski refuses to just sit and be mated, he throws his own piece into the brawl. Both kings are in danger now, and the position balances on a razor. Sliding over, Marshal's queen repositions to h5, keeping the pressure on the king's side and connecting with the rook for fresh threats. He won't let go of the attack, the queen just finds a new angle to torment the king. Relentless is the word for this white army. Grabbing back, Black's queen captures the f7 bishop, restoring some material and shoring up the defense around the king. Mlotkowski steadies the ship, the king finally has its own queen close by for protection. The wild attack is being absorbed, blow by blow. Jabbing in, Marshal's queen checks from h6, hounding the Black king and refusing to let it settle for a heartbeat. The attacker's creed, keep checking, keep probing, keep the defender sweating until something snaps. But this king is proving stubborn. Trudging, Black's king plods back to e8, weathering the check and crawling toward the center for cover. Mlotkowski's monarch has been marched all over the board, and still it survives. Every check Marshal throws, the king somehow squeezes out the other side. Overpressing badly, White rams the rook to g7, lunging for the kill, but it misfires. The crushing idea was rook to e1, pinning Black's defenders to the king and squeezing the life out. Instead the rook drifts offside and the attack wobbles. Marshal swung the hammer and missed the nail. Coolly, Black's rook lifts to d6, ready to slide across and defend the soft kingside squares. Mlotkowski calmly threads his pieces into defense, and the position starts tilting his way. The defender is finally getting organized while the attacker overextends. Backpedaling, Marshal's queen retreats to g5, trying to keep some menace alive and stay coordinated with the wayward rook. The sting is fading from the attack, and White is starting to play catch-up. When the assault stalls, those banked extra pawns start to whisper. Offering trade, Black's queen steps to f6, eyeing a swap of the most dangerous attacker on the board. Mlotkowski knows the math: trade queens, kill the attack, win with the extra material. This is the defender's dream, simplify into safety. Doubling down, Marshal finally brings his last rook to e1, seizing the open file and adding one more heavy piece to the fray. Better late than never, though the attack has lost much of its bite by now. White keeps swinging, but the knockout window is closing. Trading off, Black's queen captures on g5, ripping the most dangerous white piece off the board. Mlotkowski gets exactly the swap he wanted, queens are coming off, and with them goes the heart of Marshall's attack. The fireworks are nearly out. Recapturing, White's knight takes back on g5, restoring the balance and steering the game toward a calmer, piece and pawn fight. With the queens gone, this becomes a grind, and Marshall, down material from his gambit, now has to fight just to survive. The hunter becomes the hunted. Marching up, Black's king strides to d7, doing exactly what kings should do once the queens vanish: get active and help. Mlotkowski centralizes his monarch, sensing the endgame is his to win. The king goes from refugee to fighter in a single step, snatching with check. Marshall's rook grabs the e7 knight and checks the king, clawing back a piece and stirring up fresh trouble. Even on the back foot, he's hunting for tricks and counterplay. This game refuses to calm down. Every time it tries, somebody throws another punch. Striding on, Black's king walks to c6, shrugging off the check and pushing forward into the action. Mlotkowski keeps the king bold and central, marching it toward White's weak pawns. A confident king in the endgame is worth a fortune. Pushing a passer, Marshall shoves a pawn to g4, trying to create a runner on the king side and give himself something to fight for. With material down, his pawns are his hope. Get one rolling toward promotion and the game stays alive. The race is officially on. Slight misstep here. Black's rook dives to d2, going for activity, but rook to g8 was cleaner, stopping White's passed pawn dead in its tracks. Mlotkowski lets the g-pawn breathe, and Marshall gets a sliver of hope. A small inaccuracy, but in a tight game every tempo counts. Munching, White's g-pawn captures the bishop on f5, swiping a piece and untangling. Marshall claws material back toward balance and keeps his passed pawn dream flickering. Slowly the game is leveling out, the gambit deficit is shrinking move by move. Slicing in with check. Black's bishop crashes to f2, swiping a pawn and checking the white king in one cheeky stroke. Mlotkowski keeps the pressure flowing, hunting pawns and keeping the king honest. Both sides are swapping body blows, nobody's flinching. Dodging the check, Marshall's king slips to f1, sidestepping the bishop that just barged in. He stays calm under fire, vital when every tempo decides the endgame. And the white king is about to get its revenge on that bold bishop. Cashing the exchange, Black's bishop grabs the rook on e1, a big material win, but the bishop is now stranded deep in White's camp with the king right beside it. Mlotkowski takes the loot. Sometimes the prize comes with a price tag. Reclaiming it, White's king captures the bishop on e1, recovering the piece and restoring rough balance. Marshall sweeps the intruder away and the dust starts to settle. After all that chaos, it's nearly even again, and a rook endgame looms. Costly choice. Black swings the other rook to g8, building on the open file, but the strong move was rook takes g2, snatching a pawn and keeping the rooks humming. Mlotkowski misses the most active path, and the edge slides further toward equal. Activity is everything in rook endings. Returning the gift, White checks with rook to e6 instead of the simple king takes d2, which would calmly scoop the loose rook and go up material. Free pieces don't wait around. Both players keep missing the easy path, and this endgame is sliding into a comedy of errors. Off it goes. Black's king marches all the way to b5, deep into open ground, when rook to d6 was far safer, shielding the king and holding firm. Mlotkowski sends his monarch on a risky trek, and suddenly the king is the one exposed. Wandering kings get hunted. Missed again. Marshall checks with the rook to e5 when the pawn to a4 with check was the killer, chasing the stranded king and winning on the spot. He keeps reaching for rook checks instead of the pawn jab. This wild king hunt has both sides fumbling the knockout. Deeper into the storm, Black's king strides to c4, marching further from safety when king back to c6 was the sturdy retreat. Mlotkowski's monarch is now stranded in the middle of the board with pieces snapping all around it. This is the most dangerous king walk you'll ever see survive. Chasing the wrong dream, White shoves the pawn to f6, but king takes d2, hoovering up the loose rook for a full piece, was begging to be played. Marshall keeps overlooking that free rook on d2. The biggest miss yet, and the win simply melts away. Blinking back, Black pulls the rook to d7 for safety, but rook takes a2 was stronger, grabbing a pawn and keeping pressure alive. Mlotkowski chooses caution where boldness won, and the balance keeps wobbling. Neither side can find the clean way through this maze. Centralizing, Marshall's knight leaps to e4, planting itself in the middle and shepherding the passed f-pawn forward. He's still got that runner and a knight to escort it. The game tips back toward white as the dust begins to settle once more. Playing it safe again, black's rook drops to f7 to blockade the passer, but rook takes g2 was sharper, grabbing a pawn and staying active. Mlotkowski leans passive once more, and Marshall keeps clawing toward level. Passive rooks bleed away winning chances. Activating the king, Marshall steps to f2, marching the monarch up to back the f-pawn's advance. With queens long gone, the king is a soldier now, and Marshall pushes it forward. Every piece counts when you're scrapping for the win. Shaky again, black's rook lifts to g6, but rook to g4 was the punchier square, biting at white's pieces and pawns. Mlotkowski's rooks keep landing a step short of their best posts. In a knife-edge endgame, the gap between good and great squares is the whole game. Stumbling once more, white walks the king to e3 when rook to f5 was crushing, guarding the passer and clamping the position. The king strays into harm's way, and the edge swings straight back to black. This endgame is a pendulum that simply will not stop. Solidifying, black nudges a pawn to b6, shoring up the queen side and giving the wandering king a touch more shelter. Mlotkowski tidies his structure, sensing the long grind ahead. Small, patient moves like this are how rook endgames are quietly won, or quietly drawn. Loose once more, Marshall plants the rook on f5, but pushing the pawn to g4 was stronger, fueling the passer's run. He activates the rook yet skips the chance to send his pawn sprinting. A small slip, but this game punishes them all. Gobbling g2, black's rook swipes the pawn and slides behind white's lines, busy and biting. Mlotkowski pockets material and keeps the heat on Marshall's exposed king. The grind tilts back his way, every extra pawn nudges the scales toward black. Creating a passer, Marshall pushes a pawn to a4, trying to manufacture a runner on the queen side to balance black's threats. With the position tense, he wants his own promotion candidate in the race. Two passed pawns, two players sprinting, the endgame becomes a foot race. Blocking it, black answers with a pawn to a5, jamming white's runner and refusing to let it roll. Mlotkowski shuts down the queenside passer before it gets going. Now the position locks a little, and the fight shifts to who can outmaneuver whom. Patience becomes the weapon. Pressing forward, Marshall's king steps to f4, marching into the heart of the fight to support his army. In endings, the active king decides everything, and Marshall knows it. The old attacker is now just battling to hold the balance. Hunting pawns, black's king prowls to b3, creeping toward white's queenside pawns to gobble them up. Mlotkowski uses his active monarch to go pawn hunting, the classic endgame plan. A king on the prowl in the late game is a fearsome thing. Advancing boldly, Marshall's king climbs to e5, marching toward black's weaknesses and supporting the f-pawn's dreams of promotion. He matches black king for king, both monarchs roaming free. This is the beautiful chaos of a queenless fight, kings as warriors. Swinging across, black's rook lifts to e2, lining up on white's king and aiming to cut it off. Mlotkowski keeps the rook busy and biting, the of his counterplay. Active rook, active king, every black piece is pulling its weight. Steadying up, Marshall's rook drops to f4, knitting his pieces together and shoring up the defense. His all solidity now, working to neutralize black's active army. The man who hurled pawns into the fire is suddenly counting every single one. Feasting, black's king captures the pawn on a4, snapping up white's queenside passer and pocketing material. Mlotkowski's roaming monarch cashes in, and now he's clearly the one pressing for a win. The active king cashes in, exactly as planned. Racing forward, Marshall's king dashes to e6, charging toward black's kingside to escort his f-pawn home. With his queenside pawn gone, the f-pawn is his last hope, and he's sprinting to promote it. Everything now rides on that one runner. Slip in the rush. Black's rook shifts to h7, but rook to f8 was the move, planting it right in front of the f-pawn to stop it cold. Mlotkowski's rook ends up a step away from the perfect blockade. With a passer flying, square choice is life and death. Shepherding, Marshal's king strides to d5, clearing the path and protecting the advance of his precious f-pawn. He's all in on promotion now: push the pawn, make a queen, save the game. The whole battle has shrunk to one pawn and one dream. Circling back, Black's king returns to b3, repositioning to handle whatever White's pawn and pieces cook up. Mlotkowski keeps his monarch flexible, ready to rush back toward the action. The kings keep dancing across the board, each chasing a different prize. Sprinting home, Marshal's f-pawn lunges to f6, one step closer to glory and a brand new queen. The runner is flying, and Black has to stop it right now or the game flips on its head. This is the moment the whole endgame has been racing toward. Slamming the brakes, Black's rook swings back to h8, dropping behind the pawn to halt its run before it promotes. Mlotkowski throws his rook in the path just in time. The race comes down to the wire: pawn versus rook, promotion versus blockade. Promotion! Marshal's pawn storms to f8 and becomes a brand new queen, completing the long march that began with the 7th move gambit. For one glorious instant, White has a queen again, and a real shot at the win. But Black has a reply ready. Instant execution, Black's rook captures the freshly crowned queen on f8, killing it the very moment it's born. Mlotkowski was ready all along: the queen lived for a single move. All that running, and the pawn vanishes in a flash. Heartbreak for the attacker. Sweeping it away, Marshal's rook captures the rook on f8, swapping the heavy pieces and stripping the board down to bare bones. The material evens out and almost nothing remains. We've reached the endgame's endgame, the final, bare-knuckle phase. Launching a runner, Black pushes the pawn to a4, suddenly creating a passed pawn of his own and a fresh promotion threat. Mlotkowski flips now he has a pawn racing for a queen. The endgame finds one last twist. The pawn is off. Erring again, White pushes the c-pawn to c4, but rook to c8 was the move, swinging behind Black's runner to stop it dead. Marshal misses the cleanest block, and the pawn keeps rolling. In a race this close, one tempo can mean a whole queen. Charging on, Black's pawn lunges to a3, 2 squares from promotion and picking up speed. Mlotkowski's runner is flying toward the finish line while White scrambles to set up a blockade. Suddenly Black is the one with all the winning chances. The pressure flips entirely. Buying time, Marshal fires the rook to f3 with check, harassing the Black king and stealing a precious tempo against that runaway pawn. He'll disrupt Black however he can. Every check is a desperate stall, anything to keep the pawn off the board. Misstep here, Black's king dodges to b2, when king to b4 was safer, sheltering it while ushering the pawn home. Mlotkowski drifts a step too close to White's pieces, handing Marshal a flicker of hope. Even now, one loose king move can toss the win away. Springing into action, Marshal's knight jumps to c3, leaping toward the queening square to help blockade Black's runaway pawn. The knight becomes the hero of the defense, racing to stop promotion. White's last pieces are scrambling to build a wall in front of that pawn. One step from glory, Black's pawn lunges to a2, a single square from becoming a queen and winning the game outright. Mlotkowski's runner is at the doorstep. White must stop it this instant or lose. The whole game hangs on this one little pawn. Knight check to the rescue. Marshal's knight springs to a4 with check, harassing the king and weaving a net around the queening square all at once. This is the defensive trick that holds it together. The knight juggles attack and blockade in a single leap. Genius under pressure. Hovering close, Black's king slips to c1, escaping the check while staying glued to its pawn on a2. Mlotkowski keeps the monarch near the finish line, ready to shepherd it home. King and pawn are inches from glory, but that white knight stands in the road. Blockading hard, Marshal's rook swings to a3, clamping down on Black's pawn and refusing to let it queen. The rook and knight together build an iron wall around the a2 square. White's defense is creaking but holding, the pawn simply cannot get through. Maneuvering, Black's rook shifts to c2, trying to dislodge White's blockade and clear a path for the pawn to promote. Mlotkowski probes for a crack in the defensive wall. It's cat and mouse now. Can Black pry the pawn loose, or will White's wall hold forever? Hurrying back, Marshal's king strides to d4, rushing to reinforce the blockade against that stubborn pawn. Every white piece now has one job: keep the pawn off the board. The whole defense is one fragile fortress, and Marshall is holding it with everything he's got. Probing deeper, Black's king tucks to b1, hugging its pawn and looking for any way to break White's grip. Mlotkowski keeps maneuvering, hunting for the magic move that frees the runner. The tension is unbearable, one mistake by White and that pawn becomes a queen. Manning the wall, Marshall's king steps to d3, keeping the blockade locked and shadowing Black move for move. He won't let a single crack appear, defending with surgical care. After all the wild swings, it boils down to this: precise, patient, nerve-shredding defense. Curtain down. Black grabs the last loose pawn on c4, but the position is sealed tight. White's knight and king guard the queening square forever, and nothing breaks through. After a brawl that swung a dozen times, Marshall and Mlotkowski shake on a hard-fought draw. A war with no loser, and a ride you won't forget.